Okay. Okay, so welcome to Suitcase Divas, episode 34. My name is Denise Diabaldi with Redbirds Travel.
And I'm Cheryl Garcia with ABCD Adventures.
Yeah, and so today we have a special guest, Cory Mortensen. And so Cory, I'm just going to tell you guys a little bit. Cory, just make pretend that we're not talking about you in front of you. You just hold tight. So a little bit about Cory is he is a world traveler, an author, and an entrepreneur. Cory sold all his possessions and spent 2 years traveling the globe. A million miles traveled is what we understand. So he goes on to be a best-selling author with The Buddha and the Bee, which we both really enjoyed. It's a #1 bestseller on Amazon. So congrats on the book, Cory. And if for those that don't know, Buddha and the Bee is about your journey from Minnesota to California, and you were on a solo bike ride. So when did you decide that you were up for doing like a cross-country trip?
It was really kind of a last minute decision, and I'm sure you've picked up on that after reading the book. And again, this is before we had all our iPhones and things. So
Yeah.
um, I just became single, and I was like, I need to lose some weight, and I have this bike in the garage, and I have a friend who's getting married in California, and this all makes sense. So over a couple shots of Jameson, I decided that I was going to ride my bike, and it was only 2,200 miles. I mean, how tough could that be? And so I didn't even really plan anything. I just kind of figured out what's the first destination and how am I going to get there? And that was about as far out as I thought every day. It was like, okay, I'm looking at my Rand McNally map. It's about 50 to 100 miles. I thought 100 miles would be easy. It wasn't. And
I never thought that would be easy, by the
Yeah.
way.
and it was really warm the whole time too, which was a little bit of a blessing and a curse, but just because I don't like the cold. So it was a blessing in that it was warm. But anyway, yeah. And so it was basically just kind of feeling sorry for myself over a breakup, and let's go do something healthy.
Yeah. So we learned in the book your prep for the trip ended up, for lack of a better word, not being sufficient. So your gear changes throughout the trip. You have what you started with, and then you mail stuff off, you drop things here and there. How did your original packing list come about? How did you prep and just think of what you were going to? I'm starting with this.
Yeah, it came down to a couple things. One, I had one of those little handheld dictators with the cassette tapes. Do you remember those?
Yes.
Because I was convinced that I was going to come up with a lot of profound philosophical ideas. And
Hmm.
so I needed 8 cassette tapes and this dictator and a bunch of batteries. So that was the most important thing. And of course, a journal. And then I used to run marathons. So I was like, maybe I'll get double back into shape. So I'll bring my running clothes because after riding 100 miles, maybe I'll fit in a 5K at the end of the day. And then I brought some books because I was like, I haven't read in a long time. So maybe I should start reading some books. And again, this is before Kindle. So all these heavy books.
Right.
And then the rest of it was just kind of like shoes, socks, underwear, and I knew like when I got to Colorado, I'd be going over the Rocky Mountains, so I brought a jacket with me, and so that was pretty much the extent of it. So maybe a couple pieces of a couple of shorts, some sandals, and a couple shirts.
And what was funny is throughout the book, the things like your food. One of my favorite things is you lived off Snickers and Gatorade throughout the entire journey. And I'm just like, how are you doing this? And at no point did you say anything about first aid in your packing. I'm a Girl Scout leader, so that's one of my first things. And I'm like, where's the Band-Aid?
He didn't even pack a helmet.
Yeah, exactly. So, and you
He
had a
doesn't need a
few,
first aid kit.
right. You had a few mishaps along the way, especially with your flat tires. One of the questions we talk about throughout is how many tubes do you think you ended up using by the end of this journey?
That might be a good trivia question to put on my website sometime. I would probably put it close to 20 tubes total and
And you
one
started
tire.
out with what? How
Uh,
many?
4. That was way too many. 4. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
And
no
those
tire
nice
patch
people that gave
kits.
you 9 more.
Yeah.
I didn't even bring tire iron, so I didn't even have the proper tool to take the tire off the rim to fix the flat.
Yeah, right. Well, the other thing you were just mentioning, it's so hot and you were out there. So I'm a big advocate of like skin, like, suntan lotion, that type of deal. It seems like you kind of forego that too, right? You just kind of
You didn't have
burnt.
your sunscreen, but you did burn. You got burned.
You guys are clearly far more responsible than I was because, and to the Girl Scout point, I'm an Eagle Scout, so I should have been prepared.
Right.
But yeah, no first aid kit, no sunscreen. And even today, living in Arizona, my wife Kate gives me a lot of grief for going hiking. You can see I got some raccoon eyes going on right now. Um, for hiking in the sun. So
Well, it's not too late. I'd like
it
to advocate with Kate that you can go ahead and use the sunscreen.
okay.
It's a good thing. The
I'll start
Divas
applying it today.
recommend sunscreen. So the other thing that I thought was really interesting, because you probably know I'm kind of a candy ass. I'm not brave like that. You seem like you're the fly by the seat of your pants type of guy, and hitchhiking was like a really big part of the book. So I got curious because a lot of people offered you rides along the way, and you turned down some of them, and then some of them you took. But then the rides that you took were kind of precarious situations that maybe were a little sus. So I'm just curious, who did you decide to go with? Like, what made you take a ride from one person and turn one down?
It was I got picked up 4 times. The first one, I was just standing in the fields in South Dakota, I think, and I had just spent like 8 hours, it seemed, fighting a 500-mile-an-hour headwind. I mean, I felt like I was just drained. And this kid pulled up, and he's like, "Hey, man, you want to ride?" I'm like, "Yeah, okay." He seems pretty harmless. And so we listened to Steve Miller, and he smoked a lot of weed, and then he dropped me off in this town, and so that cut about 30 miles out of my trip. And some people would say I cheated and whatever, but I was like, it's my adventure. I can do whatever I
Yeah,
want.
I don't think you
Right,
cheated at all.
absolutely. That
Fuck
made
that.
part of the
No.
adventure is the people you met along the way and
Right.
the different
Right.
ways the travel ended up happening was part of the adventure.
Sure. Thank you. I'm glad I have you guys' support on that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
you got
it
our
was so
we got your back.
interesting. Yeah.
Now, the
I,
second one, that was the one that put me in. That one was not really the smartest move. And so I had been partaking with this young
Was that the
boy listening
Chester
to
van?
Steve Miller. So I was feeling
Hmm.
pretty comfortable. And I was again looking at farm fields for whatever reason. And these guys pulled up and they asked me if I wanted to ride to Grand Island, which was like 10 miles. And I said, sure. And then we put the bike in the back, and then I got in the back seat and I realized all the windows weren't tinted. They were spray painted black. And these 2 guys, one was Mexican, one was Guatemalan. They were there working on the harvests, and they brought me to their trailer home. And I was like, I got to get my bike out of the car, and I got to get my pack out of the car. And why am I at a trailer home? And then it turns out that they tried to convert me into Christianity, and it became kind of went down this one weird road. And then I finally, I, I don't know if they had any malice to them. I'd like to think they were genuine, but I
Mhm.
didn't feel comfortable. So I got on my bike and took off. And another time I tore a tire, so I had no recourse. And there was a repairman that picked me up, and he was really sweet. And then another time I broke my chain, and
Mhm.
I was out in the middle of Vernal, Nebraska, or the Colorado, Utah area, and there's nothing out there. And so I just took whoever was willing to stop, and it turned out to be some guy who worked on the oil rigs, and he was really sweet and took me to a bike shop. So,
That's awesome. So, have you ever picked up a hitchhiker?
I did. It's funny, after this trip, I got back to Arizona, and bought a Volkswagen bus, an old hippie bus.
Hmm.
And I had to go pick up
Nice.
all my stuff because if you read the book, you'll know I leave my bike in California. So I'm like, well, I got to go out to California, pick up my stuff. So I'm driving up the PCH in my little hippie mobile, and I meet a guy in Santa Barbara, and he looks pretty harmless, and he wasn't. And so it was like a real long ride from Santa Barbara to Carmel because there's no real place to have an excuse to kick somebody out of your car.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh.
he was he was an interesting guy. Yeah. And I've
So
also just recently picked up a guy who was stranded on the road because it was like 109 degrees, and we became friends actually. He's from Mexico City. He was here visiting, and we still kind of chat every once in a while.
that's
So
awesome. I was just
yeah.
curious. We really were, we talked about in between reading, we would message each other and be like, what did you think about this? And hitchhiking was one of them. And that was just something I was like, I wonder if he'd ever done that. Because it's different when you're on the receiving end to the offering end sometimes. You got to think that through. So that's very interesting and awesome that you've done that and had mixed experiences, which I think is par for the course for hitchhiking.
Yeah, I think so. 50-50.
Yeah. One of the things I found really interesting about the book is you talk about math on this trip a lot. And Denise and I were talking about how our interpretation of it, we felt it like it was almost like math was your travel buddy. I felt it was more of your person that was your companion. And what did you think it was? What was your
I
opinion
thought
of it?
math. So what I got out of it, it was like your almost like your motivate, like it helped you get through the miles and the hours. Like you were focusing, it was your drive. You were just like, let me get through these next 20 miles by thinking about, the math of it all. I thought it was kind of like your
Comfort.
driving force. Like it
Yeah.
helped you, your support system. Um,
So how did that
that's what I
relate, yeah, to you did you realize that you were using and talking to the math? That's how I felt. You were talking to the math throughout this whole thing, and that was your companion. Because like you said, we didn't have our phones where we could just be playing music or listening to books or whatever. That was how I pictured you communicating with somebody or something throughout the whole thing. How did math play in? How did it help you with your journey?
That is an amazing question, and nobody's even talked about it. But
got.
it was, as I kind of mentioned, it's like being in a prison cell and you're counting your paces back and forth.
Mhm.
You're out in these open fields with no real sense of anything. Every once in a while you see a lighthouse, or I call it a lighthouse, but a water tower of a small town, and you know that, okay, and there's someplace I can at least look at a human and maybe talk to somebody, get a Gatorade or whatever. And yeah, so the math was definitely, it was constant. I would look down and I'm doing 17 miles an hour, and I knew I had 92 miles to go. So and I'm not really good at math. So fortunately, it takes me a long time to calculate these things. And
Mhm.
then I was like, well, what if I go up to 18 miles an hour? And it was just a constant keeping my mind occupied. Otherwise, I don't know what else I would have thought about. And,
Yeah.
and I've done that on mountain bike races gone, where I've done like a 100-mile mountain bike race in loops of 25. And I'll get to the third loop and I'm like, where I don't remember crossing this bridge because my
Right.
mind was so occupied with something else, and I had crossed it 2 times before. But it's funny how your mind just kind of closes things
Yeah,
out, and then
kind
you're
of
like,
like tunnel
oh,
vision. You're just trying to get to the destination, the
And
final
that's why
absolutely.
when Denise and I were talking about, I felt like math was talking back to you by giving you that challenge and giving you that process and working you through. So I was like, that was your companion. She's like, that was his comfort. We had a pretty good discussion about the math in your book.
I like that. That's really great. Yeah, yeah, you're right. I mean, it really was. That's what it became.
Yeah.
So this Minnesota to California would you say that this was your longest bike ride? And like had your most monumental trip of a solo bike ride? Have you done any this far, or because it was during a whole crazy time too with the 9/11, which we'll talk about, but this particular trip seemed like it was very significant in your life. Have you had another one that was similar to this, or would you say this was your big trip?
This was what launched. I would say this really changed the trajectory of my entire life.
Yeah.
Um, Not only because of the bike ride, but then what followed after that. And yeah, had I ever done anything like this before? Absolutely not. I mean, I had this bike from a race that my sister, it was a group race. I had two friends and my sister, and it was a race from Iowa to Minnesota to Canada, and it's over 4 days. And so the first 2 days you bike 200 miles, but you do it in groups of 4. So each person does 50. And that was the longest I had ever ridden, was maybe 50 miles. And you break it up. It's not 50 miles at one time. It's 5
Mhm.
miles at a time. And you have a sag wagon and you jump. It's like a Ragnar. So you jump in and jump off it. And so your legs are always fresh and all that. And so that was the longest I'd ever ridden. And so the thought that I could do this kind of came from a picture I saw in an outside magazine where this guy was biking into the mountains with his backpack and skis attached to his backpack.
Mhm.
And I was like, 31, how hard can that be?
Right.
So yeah, I was really delusional.
It was a lot to bite off. But I love that you call yourself the hero, your hero. That was so, I love that you call yourself the hero.
Throughout the
So,
book,
but
yeah.
I have to imagine, like, how many times did you feel like giving up, and then what ultimately made you persevere? Because 100 miles a day or more, I'm baffled. But so what would you say, like, what made you actually finish? Because you could have, there's so many times you're like, I'm gonna get a Greyhound bus ticket. I'm just like, this is silly. Like, what am I doing? So
Yeah,
what made you get there?
it was every in between the math, there was also the calculation of how I can get somebody to come pick me up at the end of the
Right.
day. And and that lasted for the first 3 or 4 days. And when I finally bought a Greyhound ticket that was going to pick me up in the next town, which I Sioux Falls, which I had still another 70 or something miles to go, I stopped and got like a crappy piece of pizza, one of those gas stations, and a
Yeah.
Gatorade, and people were asking me what I was doing, and I was like, yeah, I'm biking to California, and it's kind of, there's a little ego in that, and and uh and then I was sitting there realizing maybe I don't want this to end. Maybe I do need to continue. And so when I got to Sioux Falls, I still had my bus ticket, and I went out and went to a bar and treated myself to a nice dinner. And I was looking around at all the people there that were coming there after work. And I'm like, that was my life 4 days ago.
Mhm.
And I don't know if I want to go back to that just yet. And so that, and just knowing that if I didn't do it, all my friends would give me crap for the rest of my life.
They'd
Yeah.
razz you for
And
sure.
I think that was the biggest, that was the biggest one, is I told everybody else doing it. And how much grief can your friends give you?
Absolutely,
So
yeah.
and then it was after that, then it clicked in my head. Like I was no longer wanting to finish. It just clicked that I kept wanting to keep on going. And then it got to the point where I was like, I didn't ever want it to finish. And it got, in Nevada, I was like, wait, I have 3 more days and I'll be done. And then I got really depressed because I didn't want it to end. And so it's weird how it all started. I mean, one minute I'm trying to figure out how to quit, and the next
Yep.
minute I didn't want it to end. And and I'd like to touch on the hero thing before, because it's I have had some negative feedback on that.
Oh,
And people are like, you don't know what a hero is. Like they're referring to like a firefighter or someone in
right.
the service or a police officer. And it's not that. What I'm getting at is there's a Joseph Campbell has a theory called the monomyth, which is kind of like the Luke Skywalker thing, where the young boy is at home, he goes out, he slays the dragon, and then he
Mhm.
comes home a better and more improved person. And that's where I came up with that idea, and I explain it in my next book, actually. So
Okay.
it's like the hero's journey. It's like we all go through this growth in our life where we leave home and we make our own person who we become, and then we one day return home a better person with more information and knowledge and wisdom, or we'd like to think we do anyway.
And honestly, that's how I took it. Like every day that you kept going, it was you
Sure,
were
you
your
were a hero.
yeah, you
There's
were
all kinds of
acknowledging your
different heroes.
challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never felt of it as you were comparing to the heroic movements and whatever of others. It was more of the destination, the journey, the challenges you were facing, the growth. Because one of the things you touched on, and I noticed throughout the book in the beginning, you're just accepting and loving separating from the people at the very, very beginning, but it doesn't take long before you get lonely and you're missing it seemed to me you were missing the bustle of the city, all the consistency. And then towards that end, towards that, I think towards that pivotal moment where you're like, this is ending. You were sitting in there and you were like, I don't want to sit and do this. I think I want to keep trekking. And that change is very noticeable throughout the book, how your thoughts go through that process of I'm doing this to get back to my work. Like you kept, because you mentioned how you took the time off. You only had I think it was like 2 months that had taken a time off from work, and the countdown. And then by the time you got to the end, you're like, I don't need that. So it was very interesting throughout. And I think that growth and the way you described that fits the hero that you were talking about every day. And that's what I took. And I think Denise kind of was along the same ways.
Yeah,
We
for
understood it to
sure.
be like that. You were the
Yeah, I didn't
champion
think you
every
were trying to
day.
be anything other than just what you were being on this journey. And
Right.
I love that you call yourself the hero.
We
And
did.
at the end, you were, because you friggin' made it. You never gave up. You never quit. You busted your ass. You got your ass busted. So I feel like the hero fits just fine.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
So you were also traveling during 9/11, and it was interesting because I love the format of the book, how you have the date at the front and then like your destination, your miles. It wasn't until I think September 10th, because you put the date on there, that I realized what happened the next day. And before, I couldn't wait to get to that chapter because I'm like, oh, how is this going to play in? Because you don't have cell phone, you don't have like we didn't have that instant notifications when you were doing
And
this
you're not
journey.
glued to a TV. Like, I mean,
Right. And
that's
you're
what
out in the
we
middle of
were.
nowhere.
Right.
So
You're in the middle of nowhere.
I was very interested. I was very looking forward to that chapter. And this was one of those where we always ask, remember where you were moments. And you mentioned you felt outside from it because you weren't involved with the world at the moment. And you would get it in little pieces when you ran into people. But I'm curious, when you arrived back into California, did you review the information and did it affect did you process it then? Or how was that once you got back into it and saw that we were still in a different time and the way our country people were acting at that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it hit me was 2 days after. It was September 11th, 12th. Yeah, I rented a hotel room and then watched it on the television. And that was like the most, I just, lost it. And I didn't
Yeah.
lose it from the images, because it's crazy. We all grew up kind of at the same time. I mean, we've blown up everything in movies, so everything's so hyper realistic. So
Hmm.
watching it wasn't a big thing, but when I heard one of the recordings of the husband talking to his wife,
Yeah.
excuse me, that
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
that's when I lost it.
Yeah.
And then I remember walking out and uh everybody's having breakfast, they're all
Right.
having eggs Benedict and like nothing happened. And so
Yeah.
I was kind of confused, right? And I just learned that they shut down all the airports. So I was just really kind of like, okay, I guess it's okay to be okay with what just happened.
Right.
And then when I got to California, I met three guys who were being shipped off. They were
Mhm.
Britons and they were being shipped off. And then it kind of hit me again. And
Right.
yeah, so but one, the only times it ever really came up as I was writing afterwards was I would see things like God bless WTC, and I didn't know what WTC was at first.
Right.
And there was a lot more patriotism. Like if I stopped to take a picture, everybody would stop and ask me how I'm doing. Whereas
Hmm.
before they would have just thrown an empty beer can at you. It's like it
Right.
was a completely different feel the
Everybody
rest
kind
of
of
the
came
way.
together.
I'm sorry.
I said, I feel like everybody kind of came together after that,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
just was more supportive and more loving and more patriotic.
Right.
yeah.
And
It
I'm
was
curious. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, no, that's it.
I can't wait to read book 2 to see how you navigate post 9/11 travel, because so much changed quickly with travel. And you do, at the end of this book, you do continue your travels. So is that, just give me, I just want a little tidbit. Do you have some issues when you were traveling after 9/11? Because you do continue and you leave the country in your
No,
second.
as a matter of fact, one of the first chapters I read about how shocked I was that there was no like over heightened sense of security at the
Oh,
border, and
okay.
how I was just kind of waved through and it was just like business as usual. Now, let's be fair, and I know this was a huge event. I'm not
Hmm.
minimizing it, but in the mindset of everybody, like sometimes one week is enough for us to forget about something.
Right.
And I'm not saying people have forgotten. I'm just saying sometimes it's not in top of mind anymore. So when I got there, it was almost 2 weeks after, maybe 3 weeks after. So maybe things had calmed down. Maybe initially there was a whole bunch of security and things, but when I crossed the Mexican border, it was just like the guy just waved me through. I had to search out somebody to stamp my passport.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
I
So
can't
and
wait to read
then
book 2 to hear about that. Yeah, because I was curious. That's interesting to know.
yeah, I mean, and all the way down, I made it all the way down to the southern tip of South America, and it was I can't think of a time that it was ever mentioned.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it just wasn't part
right.
of any conversations I ever had.
But it was one of those things in my mind, like I wonder how this affected moving forward. So it's very interesting to hear from that side for sure.
It did change my plans later on because my plan was in Europe to go through the stands in Iraq and all that was just
Oh
not an option
yeah.
anymore. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
probably best not. Yeah. Well, the another thing I realized a lot in the book is it's very rich in history. Like every town we're going through, it's like we're learning about everything. Is that you said you brought a journal and you had your recordings? So that must have been something where you're like, this is what I want to. Did you research a lot after writing the book? And did you know you were actually going to be writing a book about this journey when before you went on it, or it just was so monumental that you're like, damn, this could be a book? Like, how did that process come? Did that journey make you an author, or
It wasn't my intention. It was not my intention. What happened was is I was emailing people at libraries when I could find one, and my email CC list got bigger and bigger. This is before Facebook and all that.
Right.
And it was just friends saying, "Hey, my friend wants to follow your travels. Can you add them to your list?"
nice?
And so it turned out my cousin was telling me that like every Thursday they would have a little at lunch, they would all read the email so they could share it. And so she was sharing it with all her coworkers, and she kept on hounding me to write this book. And I didn't. What I didn't realize was my dad saved all my emails, and he gave me a CD of them later on. And so I
Oh.
just sat on it. And when I wrote it 20 years later, um, it it was something I wanted to do. I had written it, and I wrote it on an iPad, and I had it all written out, and I was super excited. And I left my iPad on a plane, and I was like, "Oh, I just lost everything."
Oh no.
And then when I sold my business, the company issued me an iPad, and that's when I learned about the cloud. So I logged
Oh.
in, and all of a sudden the book was there, and I was like, "Oh, this is fantastic!" And then I wrote it, read it, and it was horrible. It's just horribly written. So I started over, and the first phase was just like, okay, where did I go? Point, get the facts,
Hmm.
and with all the notes and everything. Then it was a little bit, then I got into the history of the places and stuff like that. And I was done. And I had this editor who I picked because she was exact opposite of everything I stood for. And I knew that she was going to give me a really hard time and really push me. And she did. And she goes, "Well, you have to add all this other stuff, your thoughts, your emotions, and all this." I'm like, "No way. I don't know anybody out there who's going to read this book, but I don't want them to know that much about me." And we did, and it turned out to be, I mean, that's where I get a lot of the praise is people telling me how, you know, how they see the emotion. And some
Right.
people who have done long distance trips will say the same thing. They're like, "Yep, I feel empty, lonely." You captured it really
You're very
well. So
relatable. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I would say if you're interested in doing a cross country bike trip, this book would not be the book to buy
No, it
because
is.
it's just going to tell you all the bad things.
I think
It was
it
a
though,
journey. It was an
right.
arduous journey.
Yeah.
And it was one of the things, and I related to this with you because I envisioned, because I do this. Have my plan and I see the end. I see the end of what I want it to be, what I want it to look like. I don't always have all the steps in a row to get there. It kind of builds along its way. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. And it's also encouraging to get people to get on the bike and just or whatever the adventure is and go for it, because there's going to be some things that happen along the way, but that builds who you are, that it's persevere through it, you become the hero, you are a hero when you do that. So we related to kind of all of that, the way you put that together and the way it came out, and not just for biking. That's why we've been telling people, doesn't matter if you're a biker or a traveler, this book is about the journey of a person through something.
Mm.
So it was, I'm glad you went back and put in all that stuff.
Well,
Yeah,
thank
because
you.
that
Thank you.
that definitely would making you relatable and making you human because nobody's perfect. And it's kind of it was just very genuine that you were going through this. And you told us a lot of stuff like the sock thing. I won't give that away. I'll let you read that. But you were you're just put it all out there. So one thing I will say, it's driving me crazy. I just have been so curious to talk to you today. Because the name of the book is The Buddha and the Bee. And I'm all about bees. If you know anything about, like, I'm all about, the good of the hive and how the bees all work together to be part of their community. So in this particular title, I'm wondering, like, who's the bee? What does it symbolize? How is that part of the story?
Well, the title was, I was trying to come up with the title, and it's like naming a kid, which I've never had the pleasure to do, and probably that a lot of kids out there thankful that I didn't have the pleasure. But I was trying to come up with the title, and my brother had just stopped over, and he worked at a landscape place, and he had this giant Buddha statue, and he was asking if I wanted to put it by our swimming pool. And I wasn't sure how I wanted to design everything, and I was like, "Don't worry about it. Let me think about it." So I went out for a hike, and I was up in the mountains. It was springtime, and there was the flowers were blooming, and I saw these bees, and I was thinking about his Buddha statue, and I'm thinking about probably math, and I see these bees, and I'm like, Buddha's, Buddha and the bees, oh, bees, and everybody likes Buddha, everybody likes bees for the most part, unless you're allergic, and I'm like, Buddha and the bee. So I literally ran home so I wouldn't forget it and wrote it down, and then I Googled it, Buddha and the Bee, to make sure nobody else had this title. And what I came across, if you may, I'm going to read from it because I don't have it memorized. I came across this quote, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is the perfect quote for the book, and I'm going to stick with this title. And the quote is by the Buddha, and it says, "As a bee gathering nectar does not harm or disturb the color and fragrance of the flower, so do the wise move through the world." And I was like, I'm not saying I'm wise. I'm just saying that's the way we should travel, undisturbing, you know, our surroundings and coming out more positive and wise. So I was like, I'm locked in on that title.
Nice. All
Yeah.
right, I like it. That all makes sense.
She kept asking me because I finished the book a little bit before she did. She's like, where does this come in? Where is this? And I had, when I was doing some research on you, I'd heard you on another podcast and I heard you answer. I was like, I'm not telling you. You have to ask him because it was good and I knew it was going to resonate with her. Because we also think that too. You don't, and that's not just in nature. I think that I like that quote. In the world, you don't harm. You don't put any harm around you. You just bring in the good and you take the wisdom from what's around you, kind of thing. So I think, and I absolutely think you're wise, especially after going through a journey like this, the things you've learned about yourself, about the world, about other people interacting. We think you're absolutely wise.
Yeah,
We learned a lot from you for sure.
That's great.
absolutely.
So what's next for Cory? Are you we do want to tell everyone that this is a 3-part book series that they can find on Amazon Kindle, and it is, I believe it's on audio as well, audiobook, correct?
Yep, the third one I just got the final review for the third one this morning. So I'll be listening to that today. So yes, there's
Nice.
2 on Audible, and the third one is coming probably in another month. So
Awesome. And
yeah.
you just had a big trip you just went on, so you're still traveling all these years later. So what new travels that you have in the future? What's your plans moving forward with travel?
Well, I managed to find somebody amazing to marry, unbelievably, and so she has taken on the adventurous travel spirit as well. As a matter of fact, when we married 2 years later, we sold everything and traveled through South America for 2 years. So she was willing to do that, and we lived in a tent for a long time, and we still love each other. So that's great. So moving forward, actually in a week, she just told me this morning. She says her goal is to unpack her backpack before she has to repack it next week when we go on our next trip. And so next week we're going to go up to Sonoma and ride our bicycles around
Right.
Sonoma for 5 or 6 days. Yeah, that's the next little micro trip.
That's awesome. And it's good to know that this journey, cross country did not scare you from cycling, that you continue to cycle.
I've done a lot of more cross country trips after that, so I really enjoy it. Now I call them credit card trips, where I just carry a credit card and now I just go to Marriott rather
Oh, there
than
you
finding that makes life a lot easier. Last summer I biked from Canada to Mexico on the Pacific Coast Highway, and it was all nice hotel to nice hotel.
Yeah.
So
Nice.
made it a lot
Yeah.
easier.
We're big advocates of Marriott as well.
Yeah,
because
we do love a good
we
Marriott.
get as travel agents, we get a huge discount. So
Well, make sure you put down your code so you get those bonuses to everybody who listens, so when they sign up.
that's
Oh,
right.
absolutely. Yeah. So speaking of letting our listeners know, where can they find you on like your websites or your social media? What's the best way they can follow your adventures?
Yeah, thank you. So my website is www.thebuddhaandthebee.com, one big word. And I try to post regularly on my Instagram and Facebook, some of our trips. So if you go to our website, just click on Instagram or Facebook, you'll get to my site and you can follow us there. My books are available on Amazon, and all that can be routed through the website. So it's a one-stop shop. If you go to the website, you can sign up
Find
for the
you.
newsletter and all
Oh,
that. So
awesome.
Nice.
And we'll make sure we drop the links for that in our episode
Absolutely.
description and on our own socials so you guys can find Cory. But we want to thank you so much for chatting with us. We very much enjoyed your book, and we've read the first one. We're getting ready to move on to the second one. So we thank you
awesome.
so much for
Yeah.
having or coming and joining us on our podcast. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure. It's been really awesome to meet you guys.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Thank you so much. And I think that wraps up today's episode. Everybody
All
have a
right.
wonderful day. Thanks, Cory.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
guys.
much.